Montana Territory, 1881. The wind scoured the plains like it had something to prove the morning Mara Whitlow walked into Miles City with her wedding dress folded under one arm and her 4-year-old son clinging to her skirts. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Rylan had only managed half a biscuit the night before, traded for a jar of wild honey and a frayed comb. His cheeks were too thin, his eyes too quiet for a child his age. He didn't cry anymore, just held her hand and followed. The dress was the last beautiful thing she owned. Ivory lace worn once 5 years ago when she believed love was solid ground. Her husband had died 2 winters past, spitting blood into the snow and leaving her with a hungry boy and 100 pounds of silence. Since then, it had been one long lesson in how to keep breathing with nothing left. The bell over the general store door jingled when she stepped inside. "I need to sell this," she said to the storekeeper, laying the dress flat across the counter. "It's clean, worn once." The man gave her a look, one that weighed her worth in the hollowness of her cheeks and the dirt under her nails. "Not much call for wedding dresses out here, miss." Mara stiffened. "Please, I need food for my son." With a grunt, he reached under the counter and set down a small pouch and a tin. $2 and beans. "That's the best I can do." She didn't cry, just nodded, took the trade, and turned to leave. Outside, the sunlight felt cruel. She shielded Ryland with her arm out of habit, not noticing the man standing a few paces away until he spoke. "You got someone?" Mara turned sharply, pulling Ryland closer. The man was tall and dust-worn with a lean frame and a tan hat pulled low over sharp eyes. He held the reins of a chestnut gelding in one hand and a small sack of oats in the other. "No," she said flatly, "I don't." "I saw you in there," he said, "selling a wedding dress to feed your boy. That's a hard thing." She blinked, thrown. He cleared his throat. "Name's Silas Creed. I've got a ranch 10 miles west, cattle couple, horses. It ain't fancy, but I've got food. Work too if you're looking." Mara narrowed her eyes. "You see a woman down to beans, and thought what that she'd follow a stranger into the hills." "No, ma'am." His voice was steady, soft. "I thought maybe you were the kind of woman who doesn't give up, and I've got a place that could use someone like that." She looked down at Ryland, who was staring at Silas with cautious curiosity. "What kind of work? Cooking? Laundry? A bit of help with the animals if you know how? You and your boy would be safe. You have my word on that." Mara hesitated. The coins in her pocket wouldn't last the week. She had nothing else to trade, no one left to ask. Slowly, she nodded. Silas helped her up behind the saddle, Ryland cradled in her lap. The ride west was quiet, just the wind, the rhythm of hooves, and the creak of leather. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was sliding behind the hills. The cabin was small but warm, with smoke rising from the chimney. "Tomorrow, I'll show you the barn," Silas said. "But tonight, rest, eat. You look like you haven't done either in too long." And for the first time in months, Mara stepped into a place that didn't feel like it was waiting to spit her out. The cabin was nothing grand, but it was clean and smelled faintly of cedar and stew. 2 rooms, a sturdy stove already glowing in the corner, and a cot tucked against the far wall with a thick quilt folded over it. Silas showed her around with quiet efficiency, pointing out where the water bucket sat, where the kindling was stacked, and how to work the latch on the back door. Ryland didn't say a word, just clung to Mara's skirts until she lifted him and sat by the cot. Silas ladled stew into a tin bowl and set it on the small table, then stepped back. "There's bread, too. Nothing fresh, but it'll hold you over." Mara studied him in the warm light. He didn't watch her too closely, didn't offer more than needed. There was something in that quiet that made her feel oddly unguarded. Ryland ate with both hands ravenous. Mara didn't touch her bowl until he was done. Later, after the boy had fallen asleep, curled against her side, Mara stepped onto the porch. The wind had died and the stars stretched wide above the hills, cold and bright. Silas sat on the porch rail, hat in his lap, watching the sky like it held answers. "You meant it," she said quietly. "What you said back in town. That we'd be safe. I don't say things I don't mean." She crossed her arms. "I'm not looking for anything else if that's what you're after." He didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for anything else, but if that ever changes, I'll still be right here." Mara nodded once, then turned back inside without another word. She lay awake for a long time, listening to Rylan's breathing, wondering how long she could stay before the ground gave way beneath her again. By the end of the week, she had scrubbed every surface in the cabin, fixed the latch on the chicken coop, and started cooking 2 meals a day without complaint. She didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. Silas never pushed. Rylan followed Silas like a shadow, helped carry small pails of grain, brushed the horses with serious concentration, and once fell asleep in the hayloft with straw in his hair and a kitten on his chest. Silas had carried him down without waking him, set him gently on the cot beside Mara. "You're good with him," she said that night, folding laundry by lamplight. Silas leaned in the doorway. "I like kids. Always figured I'd have some of my own. Just never met the right woman." Mara didn't answer, just kept folding. "My husband died 3 winters ago," she said finally. "He was a good man. But when he passed, people stopped helping. It was like I disappeared with him." Silas nodded. "That's a hard thing. I have nothing," she said flatly. "Nothing to offer but my hands. I already gave away the only nice thing I owned." He looked at her steadily. "You gave up a dress to feed your son. That's not nothing." Mara looked away, but her hands didn't stop moving. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just surviving the day. She was beginning to wonder what it might feel like to live through one. Spring came slowly to the hills. Snow still clung to the shadowed edges of the ridge, but the creek had begun to swell, and the soil softened enough for planting. Mara rose with the sun, most mornings collecting eggs, starting bread, brushing out Rylan's hair with gentle fingers. She moved quietly, never asked for anything. But Silas noticed the way her hands ached after scrubbing the wince when she bent too long at the wash tub. He didn't say much, just built a new washing setup near the barn with a sun-warmed barrel and a pump so she wouldn't have to stoop. When she found it the next morning, her throat tightened. "You think about things like that," he shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "I think about what makes your days easier." She didn't answer right away. But that night, when Ryland was asleep and the lamplight cast soft gold across the floor, she brought out 2 mugs of coffee and passed him one without a word. They sat beneath the cottonwood near the coop, the wind brushing through the branches above them. "I was 15 when I married Mara," said after a while. "Not because I loved him, though I learned to, but because there wasn't much else waiting for me." Silas didn't interrupt. "My mother died when I was 11. My father after. I bounced between relatives who had no use for a quiet girl who could cook but not cry." She exhaled slowly. "I thought getting married would make me someone's responsibility. But turns out, even husbands die and responsibility doesn't bury the bills." Silas took a slow sip. "You raised Ryland on your own since then. Every bite, every stitch, every step." She stared into the distance. "Sometimes I wonder if he'll remember how hungry we were, how cold." Silas's voice was quiet. "He'll remember the woman who made sure he wasn't alone." Mara looked down, brushing her thumb over the rim of her mug. "I'm not used to being seen. I saw you that first day," he said. "You walked into town with a wedding dress and a spine like iron." She smiled faintly. "That dress bought us $2 in beans. Still the best trade I ever witnessed." They sat in silence a while longer, comfort settling in like the warmth between two stones after a fire. Before heading inside, Mara pulled something small from her apron pocket, a narrow strip of soft white cotton. I started cutting pieces, she said, barely above a whisper. For a dress, not for trade, not for mourning, just because I want to. Silas met her gaze steady and calm. Then I'll build you a sewing frame. A good one. Her eyes softened. You always doing things for people who don't ask. His voice was quiet. Only when I hope they'll stay. That night, Mara laid the cotton pieces across the foot of the cot and touched them like they were something sacred. And for the first time in years, she wasn't ashamed to want something just for herself. Days stretched longer. The wind warmed. Wildflowers appeared in bursts along the fence line. Rylan ran barefoot through the grass cheeks full laughter, chasing chickens. Every evening after supper, once the dishes were dry and the boy was curled beneath a quilt, Mara sat near the window sewing. Her fingers, roughened from years of labor, moved with care over the soft white cotton. Silas never asked how far along the dress was. He didn't hover. He just noticed the new curve of the bodice draped over the chair or the gathering pleats of the sleeves as they took shape. He spent his days mending fence lines, checking cattle, planting a kitchen plot behind the cabin, just because Mara mentioned missing carrots. Every time she looked out the window, he was working shirt damp with sweat boots sunk in mud hands steady. One afternoon, Ryland plopped down in the dirt beside her with a piece of chamomile in hand. Mr. Creed says when I'm a little bigger, he'll teach me to ride the roan, he said proudly. Mara wiped flour from her fingers and knelt. You want to do that? Ryland nodded, his voice quieter. He says I sit straight like I was born in a saddle. She smiled and kissed the crown of his head. Then we'll see about it. That night, Silas came in with a scuff on his cheekbone and a rabbit over his shoulder. He handed it off with a nod, then paused. You're blistered, he said, glancing at her hands as she cleaned the table. I scrub. It's part of staying clean. I've got an easier setup in the barn now, he said. If you want it. You always fixin' things for me. He shrugged. It's what you do when something matters. 2 mornings later, she found a second wash tub set on bricks, a fire ring built from river stones, and water already warming in the sun. She didn't say much, just used it. But that night, she set a fresh loaf of cornbread beside his coffee and murmured, "Thank you." Later, beneath the cottonwood, they sat again, closer this time. Silence settled between them like soft cotton, familiar and warm. I had a sister, Silas said quietly. Younger than me. Lost her to diphtheria. She was the only one who could ever calm a panicked colt, or sew a saddle strap that wouldn't rub. Mara turned her mug slowly in her hands. I had no one. After my father died, it was just me. I married for shelter. Then he died too. Silas didn't offer pity. He only listened as if holding space was something sacred. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out another folded strip of cotton. I think I'm ready to finish the dress, she said. Not because I need to, because I want to wear something that reminds me I'm still here. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then it'll be the finest thing this valley's seen. Her lips curved small but real, and in that quiet evening light, with chamomile drying on the sill and Ryland dreaming softly behind the door, Mara realized she hadn't just found kindness on this land. She'd begun to find her footing. She'd begun to believe again. The days folded into one another like rows of stitched cloth, slow, careful, strong. Each evening, once Ryland had drifted to sleep, Mara took her place by the window and continued piecing the dress together. It came alive beneath her hands. First the bodice, then soft pleated sleeves, and finally a hem wide enough to catch the breeze. She didn't tell Silas it was nearly done. Somehow, he already knew. The cabin began to feel less like a borrowed shelter and more like a home. She found herself humming while kneading dough, wiping down the table just a little slower than necessary. She caught Silas watching her sometimes, not with want, but with something steadier. A man measuring time not in days but in care. One morning, while weeding the plot behind the cabin, she spotted a patch of wild chamomile near the fence. It smelled faintly of apples. She picked it and laid it to dry, not for tea, but for Rylan's pillow. He'd started to whimper in his sleep. No words, just the sound of a fear still buried too deep to name. She didn't speak of it to Silas, but he must have known. The next morning, she found a small carved horse at Rylan's bedside. Sanded smooth its eyes, painted with a steady hand. The boy hugged it to his chest and slept more soundly that night. That evening, Mara brought out a tin plate of cornbread and handed it to Silas. "I made this. With the last of the meal you hauled back from Blake's." He took the plate and sat on the porch rail. "You didn't have to. I know, but I wanted to." He ate quietly for a while. Then Harris Ranch lost some cattle to wolves. Asked me to ride perimeter, just for a week or two. Mara crossed her arms. "You thinking of going?" I told him no. He said simply, "There's enough here that needs tending." She sat beside him, watching the chickens settle in the twilight. "You could have gone. You don't owe us anything." Silas set the plate aside. "It's not about owing. I don't want to be anywhere you and Rylan aren't." Mara turned her face slightly so he wouldn't see the way her throat tightened. "I never thought I'd be the kind of woman a man stayed for. I'm not staying," he said gently. "I'm living with you. Here." She stood and crossed the yard, but paused at the door. "I'll wear the dress on Sunday," she said, voice almost a whisper. "That is, if you still want to stand beside me." Silas rose slowly, the empty plate forgotten behind him. "If I get to stand beside you, there's nothing else I'd want more." Sunday came with soft wind and a sky the color of linen. Silas wore his best shirt and boots scrubbed clean. Mara stepped out in the dress she had sewn with her own hands, white cotton tied at the waist, with a blue ribbon she'd found at the bottom of her sewing tin. Her hair was braided back simple and sure. They stood beneath the cottonwood tree. Rylan waded barefoot in the grass, holding a small bouquet of chamomile and thistle. "I don't have a preacher," Silas said. "Don't have a paper either. But I've got my word, and it's yours." Mara looked up at him, sunlight glinting in her eyes. "That's all I ever needed." She reached for his hand. And this time, she wasn't holding back. Rylan stepped forward, small feet stirring the grass, and held out the wildflowers. Silas knelt to take them, his voice rough as he asked, "Is it all right if I call you my boy now?" Rylan nodded without hesitation. "It's more than all right," he said softly. They stayed out beneath the cottonwood long after the breeze settled and the sun sank behind the ridge. Ryland fell asleep with his head in Mara's lap, and Silas sat beside her, his arm resting along her shoulders, fingers brushing the ends of her braid. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again," Mara said, voice barely above the hush of the grass. "You are," Silas murmured, "and you always will be. Not because I said so, but because I'll make it so." She leaned into him, letting herself believe it. By midsummer, the garden behind the cabin flourished. Beans climbed, twine strung between wooden stakes, and wide squash leaves stretched to catch the morning sun. Mara found comfort in the rhythm of tending, pruning, watering, listening to the soft click of bugs beneath the leaves. Her hands, once blistered and raw, grew strong again, not with desperation, but purpose. Silas built a second drawer into the kitchen table. She used it to store thread ribbon and a piece of pale cloth she was hemming into a shirt for Rylan. He'd begun to outgrow the ones Silas had passed down. He never complained, but she noticed anyway. Late one afternoon, as light slanted gold across the pasture, Silas rode up with a canvas bundle tied behind his saddle. Dust streaked his shirt, but there was something quiet and sure in his eyes. "I stopped by the ledger office in town," he said, handing her the bundle. Inside was a framed deed. Her name was written there beside his in ink steady as a fence line. "I wanted you on it," he said. "Not for show, because this place is yours too." Mara stared at the paper thumb pressed to the edge. "I never asked for this." "I know," he said, "but it's still yours." She carried it inside and set it near the hearth. The weight of it wasn't heavy, it was solid. A kind of permanence she'd never thought to have. That evening, Rylan helped Silas gather eggs, chase the hens back into the coop, then curled up on the porch with his carved horse in hand. Mara brought out supper fried potatoes, the last of the cured pork, and warm cornbread. As the sky turned lavender and fireflies blinked through the grass, Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "You ever think about how far we've come?" She glanced at Rylan, sleeping beside her. "Every day." And when she reached over to take his hand beneath the soft porch light, it wasn't a gesture of gratitude. It was a vow returned, quiet, steady, complete. The house grew with the seasons. Silas added 2 rooms, one for Rylan, with a loft window that caught the morning sun, and another off the east side a porch where Mara liked to sit and shell peas in the breeze. Neighbors began calling them the Creed family, not out of assumption, but because no one remembered them any other way. Mara didn't correct it. She liked how it sounded. Ryland learned to read and ride. He carved his initials into the barn door with a borrowed pocket knife and built a rabbit trap that never caught anything. He brought home frogs in his pockets, sticks he swore were swords, and 1,000 questions for Silas, all of which were met with quiet answers and steady patience. Mara stitched a Sunday shirt for Ryland from the leftover cotton of her wedding dress. The same dress she'd once sold to feed him now lived again, reshaped by her own hands. One morning, while Silas was off mending a distant fence line, she found herself standing at the hearth, her hand resting on the framed deed. She thought of the girl she used to be, the one who walked into Miles City with a child and a dress. That girl had no idea she'd one day have a roof that didn't leak, a son who laughed in his sleep, and a man who never raised his voice but always raised his hand to help. That afternoon, Silas rode back from the ridge with a letter in his pocket. "My cousin's passing through," he said. "Wagon team from Cheyenne. Reckon they'll stay the night." Mara raised an eyebrow. "Does he know about me?" "I told him I married a woman who could outwork most men, cook better than any fire pit stew I've tasted, and turn this patch of earth into something worth waking up for." She didn't answer, just smiled and set another plate on the table. When the wagon arrived, 4 girls spilled out like sparrows' bonnets, askew arms full of shawls and tin toys. Ryland watched them with wide eyes and muddy boots. Matthew Creed, tall and quiet like his cousin, brought blankets and stories. His wife helped Mara draw water and peel potatoes while the girls settled in with Ryland, exchanging ribbons and giggles. That night, after supper beneath the cottonwood, one of the girls asked if Ryland was Mara's real son. She looked at the child, then at Ryland, barefoot in the grass holding a chamomile flower. "He's my boy," she said simply. Silas looked over, not with surprise, but with pride. Later, as the stars came out and the fire died low, Mara and Silas stood at the back edge of the garden, watching the moon rise. "They'll leave in the morning," he said. Mara nodded. "But we'll still be here." And she said it like someone who knew what staying meant, not surviving. but choosing. The next morning, the wagon creaked off down the dusty trail, girls waving through the back flap Rylan, chasing it halfway to the bend with a stick sword raised in farewell. Mara packed a basket that afternoon, bread, dried apples, and a jar of beans, and they rode out together, the three of them, to a bluff that overlooked the prairie. Ryland nestled between them, shoulders pressed to Silas's side. The cottonwood above cast flickering shade, and the breeze smelled of wild grass and sun-warmed earth. Silas reached into the basket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "I stopped by the notary," he said, asked for something a little more official. Mara unfolded it slowly. At the top, the words read, "Certificate of Marriage." Their names, Mara Whitlow and Silas Creed, were written beneath in black ink, dated and signed. She looked at him, eyes shining. "I thought we already did all this." "We did," he said with a slow grin, "but I figured we ought to put it in writing. For Ryland, for the land, for us." She folded it gently and tucked it back into the basket. "There's not a part of this I'd change." That night, they lay side by side beneath a quilt stitched from scraps of old shirts and flour sacks. Ryland slept nearby, his wooden horse curled against his chest. The scent of cooling bread hung in the cabin, and the wind hummed soft against the shutters. "You're not afraid anymore," Silas murmured. Mara rested her head against his chest. "No," she whispered, "not anymore." Years passed. The garden doubled. The house stretched taller. Chamomile bloomed along the fence line each spring. Ryland carved his name into fence posts, built real rabbit traps that finally caught something and grew into his boots before Mara could mend them. The townsfolk never called them anything but the Creed family, and no one ever asked why. On quiet evenings, when the prairie hushed and the chickens settled into sleep, Mara and Silas sat on the porch steps, hands intertwined, listening to the slow breath of the land. Peace, Mara learned, didn't always arrive with grand gestures. It came in warm bread, in laughter, in the way a man looked at her, not for what she'd lost, but for what she had become. And what she had become was this: loved, fully, without question, and home.